I am Glen W. Farris of Oklahoma City. I am making this recording on February 3rd, 1967. I am at present Executive Vice President of the National Cowboy Hall of Fame and Western Heritage Center. Having been connected with this project practically ever since its inception, I have been asked to record the history of the institution. I have been asked first to record something of my background. After graduating from the University of Oklahoma and having worked in other positions a few years, I was employed by the Oklahoma City Chamber of Commerce in 1923 as office manager and bookkeeper. I soon also became secretary of the convention division of the chamber. I handled this work as secretary of the conventions division for many years, in addition to other duties. During this period, Oklahoma City was celebrating the 50th anniversary of its founding in 1939, and our convention division set up as our goal that year to try to obtain 1,000 conventions for Oklahoma City. We ended the year with 959 conventions, almost reaching our goal. During my tenure with the Chamber of Commerce, I handled nearly every phase of the activities of the Chamber at one time or the other, including the managership of the dining room, secretary of the Good Roads Division, manager of the Public Welfare Division, and in my later years, my principal job was managing the Agriculture and Livestock Division. I helped organize the Sirloin Club of Oklahoma and served as many years as its first secretary and treasurer. During my time as manager of the Agriculture and Livestock Division, I probably signed checks for more than $500,000 for the 4-H Club and FFA boys and girls of the state. I got a great deal of satisfaction out of this, mainly because it was someone else's money instead of my own that I was spending. When Mr. Stanley Draper was made manager of the chamber, about 1930, I was appointed assistant manager, and later the title was changed to executive secretary, which position I held at the time of my retirement from the chamber in 1962. While with the chamber, it fell to my lot to handle Oklahoma City's bid to have the National Cowboy Hall of Fame located here, and acted as general manager of that project along with my chamber duties until I retired, and since 1962 have been serving as executive vice president without compensation. The idea of building a National Cowboy Hall of Fame was originated by Mr. C.A. Reynolds during the late 1940s, while he was chairman of the board of the H.D. Lee Company of Kansas City, Missouri. He said he got the idea while visiting the Will Rogers Memorial at Claremore, Oklahoma. Here he said he saw a great and worthwhile memorial to one great Westerner, and the idea came to him as to why it would not be a good idea to build a memorial to all of the great cowboys of the West. During his travels throughout the country, he talked about this with many people, visiting the governors of all of the western states and discussing it with them, with various United States senators and other prominent people. He said that they all agreed that this would be a wonderful undertaking and a very worthy thing to do. They all promised their cooperation. He got the consent of each of the governors to serve as ex officio members of a board of trustees for the organization. Then 2 additional men in each state were selected, usually upon recommendation of the governor. One of the first men selected was Albert K. Mitchell, prominent rancher of New Mexico. It is interesting to note how he was selected. Mr. Reynolds said that he was talking with Clayton P. Anderson of New Mexico, who at the time was serving as Secretary of Agriculture and who later became senator from that state. He is a Democrat and had served as national committeeman from the state of New Mexico for the Democratic Party. When asked who he would recommend in the state of Mexico to serve as a trustee, he said that Albert K. Mitchell would be the best man he could get if he would consent to serve. He said that Mr. Mitchell was chairman of the that Mr. Mitchell was national committeeman for the Republican Party in New Mexico and always gave him a hard time whenever he was running for office. But in spite of this fact, he said that Mr. Mitchell would be the best man for the job if he could be obtained. At the first meeting of the Board of Trustees, Mr. Mitchell was elected as first vice chairman and chairman of the executive committee. When Mr. Reynolds passed away in 1958, Mr. Mitchell was elected chairman of the board and has served in that capacity ever since. Mr. Mitchell has been regarded for many years as probably the most outstanding cattleman in the United States. He served at one time as president of the American National Cattlemen's Association, president of the American Hereford Association, president of the American Quarter Horse Association, was chairman of the board of the International Livestock Show in Chicago, a trustee of Cornell University, and a director of many business organizations in his part of the country. Other prominent men selected on the original board of directors were as follows: Fred H. Dressler, who was then an official of the American National Cattlemen's Association and was later elected and served 2 terms as president of that organization. Jasper D. Ackerman, president of the Exchange National Bank of Colorado Springs, Colorado. Ray Schnell of Dickinson, North Dakota, a prominent rancher and operator of several livestock sales organizations in that part of the country. A.D. Brownfield, Sr. of New Mexico, who a former president of the American National Cattlemen's Association and prominent rancher in that state. Nelson R. Crow, publisher of the Western Livestock Journal in Los Angeles. Former U.S. Senator Harry Darby of Kansas City, Kansas. G.R. Jack Milburn, rancher of Montana, who later served as president of the American National Cattlemen's Association. Frank L. Spencer, a rancher and bank director of Great Falls, Montana. E.H. Shoemaker, Jr. of the Milldale Ranch Company of North Platte, Nebraska. Brooks Keogh, a prominent rancher in North Dakota, who later served 2 terms as president of the American National Cattlemen's Association. Roy J. Turner, prominent rancher and oil man of Oklahoma City and former governor of Oklahoma, was not on the original Board of Trustees, but was elected shortly thereafter and has served ever since. All of these men and many others are still serving on the Board of Trustees, and during the years have spent many thousands of dollars of their own money attending meetings of the board and of various committees from time to time. When Mr. Reynolds first planned the project, he had in mind that it would be a rodeo cowboys Hall of Fame. But as he discussed the matter with other people, they decided that they should also include the working cowboys, and later on decided that it should be a shrine honoring the great men of the West who had contributed significantly to its development, that is, to the development of the West. That is the reason we now have 2 halls of honor in the center, one called the Hall of Fame of Great Westerners, and the other the Rodeo Hall of Fame. The first meeting of the Board of Trustees was held in Denver, Colorado on January 21, 1955. Mr. Reynolds was elected as chairman. Mr. Albert K. Mitchell, first vice chairman. Mr. Fred H. Dressler, second vice chairman. And Mr. A.M.G. Swenson of the Swenson Land and Cattle Company of Stamford, Texas, third vice president. Mr. Fred S. Porter, Jr. of Phoenix, Arizona, was elected secretary, and Mr. R.J. Hoffman, president of the American National Bank of Cheyenne, Wyoming, as treasurer. Oklahoma City first became involved when Mr. E.K. Gaylord, publisher of the Daily Oklahoman and Oklahoma City Times, read a story which Mr. Reynolds had released to the press about his proposal to build a Cowboy Hall of Fame. Mr. Gaylord wrote to him and complimented him on the idea and suggested that Oklahoma City would be a wonderful place in which to build the institution. Mr. Reynolds told him that the location of the shrine would be decided by the Board of Trustees when it was set up. Mr. Gaylord then talked with Mr. Stanley Draper, manager of the Chamber of Commerce, and got his interest in the project, and the Chamber carried the ball from that point on. in putting on a campaign to bring the shrine to Oklahoma City. One of the first things that the Board of Trustees decided to do at their first meeting in Denver was to proceed with the selection of a site for the project. They decided to appoint a locations committee, which consisted of Mr. Ray Snell of North Dakota as chairman, Mr. Albert K. Mitchell of New Mexico, Mr. Fred Dressler of Nevada, Mr. A.M.G. Swenson of Texas, and Mr. John D. Lewis of Utah. Mr. Reynolds had already received many letters from various communities asking to be considered as the location. They decided to announce that February 28th, 1955 would be the deadline for receiving bids. Then on March 1st, the locations committee got together and went over the scores of bids which they had received. Mr. Snell said that there were 46 cities who had submitted comprehensive invitations, but there were many more that had written letters asking to be considered. One of the instructions given to the locations committee by the Board of Trustees was that they should go over all of the bids and sift them down to 5 communities, and that these 5 communities would then be invited to send representatives to the next meeting of the Board of Trustees to present their cases, and that the final decision would be made from among these 5 by the board. In going over the bids, the location committee finally sifted down to 10 communities in 10 different states. These were Cheyenne, Wyoming, Prescott, Arizona, Colorado Springs, Colorado, Dodge City, Kansas, Miles City, Montana, North Platte, Nebraska, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, Las Vegas, New Mexico, Canyon, Texas, and Rapid City, South Dakota. They then decided to charter an airplane and visit these 10 cities. They sent word ahead of time to each of the cities, telling them when they would arrive so that the cities would be prepared. The committee said that they were given a rousing reception at each of the 10 stops. Many of them had large crowds of people at the airport to meet them, and Mr. Mitchell remarked to Mr. Reynolds after it was all over that the President of the United States could not have received a warmer reception in these cities than they had received. Each city had been told in advance the points that would be considered by the location committee in the selection of the site. They agreed that on their trip they would not discuss the merits of the various cities, but would make their own notations concerning each city, and then after all had been visited, they would compare notes and make their selection. Mr. Snell later told me that Oklahoma City had barely gotten into the 10 finalists as number 10 on the list. But Mr. Swenson related that when they had visited the last city and were on the airplane, en route back to Denver, where they were to have their meeting and make a final decision, he asked why they could not start talking about the matter on the plane. He proposed that each man write the name of the city on a slip of paper that he considered the number one choice. And he said that Oklahoma City was number one on each man's ballot. The committee decided to select only 3 cities for final consideration instead of the 5 as they had been instructed to do. They did this because they said that on the basis of the presentations made to them at the time of their visit, only 3 cities would have any chance of being selected, and they did not think that 2 other cities should be asked to go to the expense of sending a delegation to the meeting of the trustees and putting on the campaign which they would no doubt want to do. Quite a hassle resulted over this decision of the locations committee, because a number of the committees who were not included complained that the locations committee had not carried out their instructions to sift the group down to 5 cities. The other 2 cities selected for final consideration, along with Oklahoma City, were Colorado Springs, Colorado, and Dodge City, Kansas. Each of these cities was then notified to send a delegation of not more than 6 people to attend the next meeting of the Board of Trustees in Denver on April 15, 1965. Paragraph. Before the Locations Committee visited Oklahoma City for their original inspection, Mr. Roy J. Turner, former governor, had been asked to serve as chairman of the Oklahoma Committee. He organized what was known as the Oklahoma Committee for the National Cowboy Hall of Fame, with representatives from various parts of the state. And it was in their name that the campaign was carried on. Mr. Snell later told us that the main reason why Oklahoma City was number one on the list of all the members of the committee was that they had been impressed with the orderly and businesslike manner in which our invitation was presented, and they felt that the shrine would be in good hands if it were located here. The Locations Committee decided that they would not reveal to the other members of the Board of Trustees the order in which they had ranked the 3 final cities. Mr. Snell said that many of the board members had asked them to tell them which city they considered best, but Mr. Mitchell simply said for them to attend the meeting, and he was sure they would be able to spot the city which they had selected as number one from the presentations made there. We in Oklahoma City prepared a leather-bound brief on our case and sent it to each of the trustees prior to the meeting in Denver. The 6 men who represented Oklahoma City at the meeting were Roy J. Turner, Raymond Gary, who was then governor of Oklahoma, O.C. Brown of the Oklahoma Publishing Company, Bertie Deering, editor of the Farmer Stockman, Glen Farris, and Roy P. Stewart, columnist for the Daily Oklahoman. When we arrived in Denver, we found that the city was filled with people from Dodge City, Kansas. They had brought several special train loads of people with them, about 100 horses and several bands, and put on a big parade in Denver that morning. However, they were allowed to have only 6 people in the meeting where the presentation was made. Each of the cities was told that they would have 1 hour to present their case, and then would be allowed an additional 15 minutes for questions from the floor. None of the delegations were allowed to be in the meeting when one of the rival cities' presentation was being made. However, our Oklahoma trustees, Mr. Hal Cooper of Woodward and Lee V. Sneed of Oklahoma City, and Governor Gary, were in the meeting. Dodge City and Colorado Springs presented their cases first, and then Oklahoma City was called in. Governor Turner, as chairman of the Oklahoma Committee, presented the invitation on behalf of the state. He then called upon Governor Gary, who gave his views as to why he felt that the shrine should be located in Oklahoma. O.C. Brown then presented statistics on Oklahoma City to show that it was a growing and progressive community. I was then called on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce to make the principal argument. In our presentation, we of course stressed the location of Oklahoma City on 5 federal highways and the fact that we were at the hub of 3 of the proposed interstate highways, which were to be built throughout the nation. We also stressed the fact that we were the only one of the 3 cities located on a major transcontinental highway, which was Highway 66, which carries more traffic year-round than any other transcontinental highway. We also showed slides and motion pictures of the proposed site overlooking Highway 66. We also expressed our opinion that in order for such a shrine to succeed, it would have to have the support of a fairly large city, and that Oklahoma City was the largest of the 3 cities being considered. Although the amount of money which each city would be willing to put up had never been mentioned as a point which would be considered, following my presentation, one of the trustees said that he knew it was going to take considerable money to build the kind of a project which we had in mind, and he said he thought they should have been asking each delegation how much money they would be willing to put up. He asked the question if the trustees would ask Oklahoma City to put up $100,000, would we be willing to do so. Since we had not considered this matter, and since our committee was scattered throughout the room and could not confer, I knew that if any such promise were made, the Chamber of Commerce would have to stand behind it. So I told the trustee that we believed we could supply that amount of money. He said, well, if the figure was $200,000, would we be able to put up that much? After some hesitation, I stated that I believed we would be able to raise that amount of money. Then he said, well, what if the figure is $500,000? Not knowing how much of a bearing this discussion was going to have in the final decision, and knowing that I could not take the authority of pledging that amount of money, I answered the question by stating that I had observed that this Board of Trustees is made up of men with fair minds and good judgment, and that therefore, if they asked us to put up $500,000 as our share of the project, we would make every effort to raise it. I was glad that the questioner did not go on up to $1 million. Although Oklahoma later did go on to raise more than $1 million as its part of the building fund. It was getting rather late in the evening when our presentation was completed, and the board decided to postpone a vote until the next morning. I later learned that that night, Governor Fred Hall of Kansas, who was a Republican, had called all of the Republican governors in the 17 states, and they were in the majority at that time, and asked them to instruct their delegation to vote for Dodge City. He said it would not do for the Democrats to get charge of it like they would do in Oklahoma. Some of the governors did call their representatives, but I found that in most cases they simply told them to use their own best judgment in the matter. Next morning, when the meeting was reconvened, each of the 3 states was given time for a 10-minute rebuttal. At that time, I was told that the governor of Kansas said that he had learned that Oklahoma City had come up and offered $500,000 for the project, and that he said that if the project was located in Dodge City, he would personally see to it that 1 million people in Kansas would donate $1 each, and they would raise $1 million. The trustees decided to take 2 ballots, one for all 3 cities, and then the second ballot on the 2 cities receiving the highest number of votes on the first ballot. The vote on the first ballot was Oklahoma City 20. No, that is not correct. Oklahoma City 18, Dodge City 8, and Colorado Springs 6. On the second ballot, Oklahoma City received 20 votes, Dodge City 11, and 1 vote was still cast for Colorado Springs. A motion was then made by Kansas trustee Fred Heine and seconded by Judge McCarthy of Colorado that the vote be made unanimous in favor of Oklahoma City. And this motion carried. The press had not been allowed to be in the room during the voting, but were waiting on the outside of the room to receive the story. I was told that the governor of Kansas told the press that they had been sold down the river, that the project had been sold to the oil-rich Oklahomans for $500,000. This was the story that went out all over the country, and of course made the Kansas people very angry. Many of them have not gotten over it to this day. The Dodge City delegation said that they would go home and build their own Cowboy Hall of Fame. And although the two other trustees from Kansas, Fred Heine and Harry Darby, went along wholeheartedly with the Oklahoma City selection and tried to raise a quota of funds in Kansas, very little has been subscribed up to this date. On the other hand, the people of Colorado and Colorado Springs have been most cooperative. Colorado is one of the 4 states that has more than subscribed the quota assigned to them, and more money was subscribed from Colorado Springs than from any other community in the state. This is largely due to the efforts of Jasper Ackerman. Following Oklahoma City's selection as the site, we organized what has been known as the Oklahoma Association for the Cowboy Hall of Fame, and set up a separate corporation in that name. The association was headed by Roy J. Turner as president, Ferdy Deering first vice president, Judge Otto C. Barbie of Beaver second vice president, and Darrell Butler of Pauls Valley third vice president. Directors were appointed in all of the counties of the state. At one of the first meetings of the Executive Committee of the National Board of Trustees held in Oklahoma City, they decided to set a goal of $5 million for the project. Oklahoma volunteered to raise $1 million of this amount, and the remainder was allocated to the other 16 states on a population basis. New Mexico, under the leadership of Albert K. Mitchell and A.D. Brownfield, was the first state other than Oklahoma to raise its quota. And since that time, North Dakota and Colorado have oversubscribed their quotas. The first meeting of the Board of Trustees in Oklahoma City was held on December 11, 1955, at which time an elaborate ceremony to dedicate the site was held. Meanwhile, the National Cowboy Hall of Fame and Museum had been incorporated in the District of Columbia on October 6, 1955. The reason the District of Columbia was selected as the place in which the project would be incorporated was to give it more of a national status. A concurrent resolution was adopted by both houses of Congress on August 5, 1957, designating the National Cowboy Hall of Fame and Museum as a national memorial. At the Board of Trustees meeting on December 11, 1955, the first 5 men to be honored in the Hall of Fame of Great Westerners were selected. These were Will Rogers, Theodore Roosevelt, Charles Goodnight, Charles M. Russell, and Jake McClure. It was decided that for the time being, only deceased persons would be selected for this honor, and that later on each of the 17 states would be allowed to nominate one person each year to the Hall of Fame. Usually the person to be nominated is selected by the state through a statewide nominating committee, including people who have a historical background. The nomination then has to be presented to the Board of Trustees, and a vote of 3/4 of the trustees in attendance at any meeting is required for election. The first campaign for funds was held in Oklahoma City in February 1956. We had set a goal of $750,000 for this campaign, and the amount of $758,000 was raised in a whirlwind campaign of only 8 days. This included the $150,000 value of the site being donated by Oklahoma City. And after all of the other water had been squeezed out of the subscriptions that were turned in during the campaign, we ended up with about $550,000 of valid subscriptions. A campaign was then carried on to raise an additional $250,000 in the rest of Oklahoma during the month of March 1956. This campaign was also successful. Oklahoma City put on a second campaign in 1961, in which approximately $300,000 additional was raised. It was decided that the best way to select the architect for the building was to conduct a nationwide competition. The assistance of the American Institute of Architects was sought in this competition, and they agreed to allow it to be carried on with their sanction, although they did not sponsor the competition. In order to have their sanction, they required that they be allowed to appoint a majority of the judges. Consequently, a judging committee of 5 persons was set up, and the AIA appointed Mr. Frank McNett, an architect from Nebraska, as chairman, Mr. O'Neill, O''Neil, Ford of San Antonio, Texas, an architect, and John Carl Warnicki, a prominent architect of San Francisco. Who has since been selected to build the Kennedy Memorial in Washington, D.C. Mr. Phil Wilbur, chief architect of Oklahoma State University at Stillwater, served as advisor in the competition. This was a tremendous job because he had to almost design the building himself in order to set up uniform rules that all could follow in the competition. He did it without any compensation. A total of 259 architects from all parts of the country submitted designs in the competition. We had offered the Architectural Commission for the building as the first prize, together with an immediate payment of $10,000. Second prize was $3,000. Third prize, $2,500. And 7 fourth prizes of $1,500 each. The architects who submitted the winning design were a couple of young architects from Michigan, Harold Jack Begro and Jack Brown. These young men worked for separate architectural firms in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, near Detroit. These two young architects worked for separate architectural firms, but when they won this competition and received the $10,000 prize money, they organized an architectural firm of their own and have been going strong ever since. I neglected to say that two of our trustees served with the three architects on the judging committee. These were Albert K. Mitchell and Roy J. Turner. Groundbreaking ceremonies for the building were held on January 7, 1958, during the convention of the American National Cattlemen's Association, which was being held in Oklahoma City at that time. Mr. Reynolds passed away in December 1958, and although he had seen the plans for the building, he did not live to see it started. This was a great loss to the institution because Mr. Reynolds had retired from his business and was in a position to spend a lot of his time on the project. It was decided that the first unit of the building should be one that would cost about $1,500,000, and the architects were instructed to draw detailed plans for this portion of the building. These plans were completed during the summer of 1959, and bids for construction were opened on May 27, 1959. Lippert Brothers, contractors of Oklahoma City, were the successful bidders. We had about $1 million of funds in hand at this time, but we thought that additional funds would come in more rapidly after construction was started. The bids that were taken were for about $1 million of the $1.5 million project. Therefore, when this contract was completed, we had only a shell of a building, and since money had not come in as we had expected, we had to suspend construction for 2 or 3 years while efforts continued to raise money for its completion. The state of New Mexico was the first state to complete its quota outside of Oklahoma, and North Dakota followed suit shortly thereafter. No other state has had as yet reached its quota except Colorado, which through the efforts of Jasper Ackerman oversubscribed its quota during the latter part of 1966. Finally, after efforts had been made to raise enough money for completion of the unit of the building which we had started had bogged down, the trustees decided to try to sell revenue bonds for enough to complete this portion of the building. After plans had been set up to try to sell $1 million worth of bonds for the institution, the Oklahoma City Chamber of Commerce became again very active in trying to help complete the building, and the industrial arm of the chamber, known as the Oklahoma Industries, in consultation with local bankers, determined that it would probably be best to tie some industrial projects in with the Hall of Fame on the bond project, as they felt that the bonds would have a better sale if something more than the Hall of Fame was behind them. Consequently, Oklahoma Industries set up a trust known as the Oklahoma City Industrial and Cultural Facilities Trust. They issued approximately $2,500,000 worth of tax-free bonds, paying 5% interest. Approximately $1 million of this money was to go for completion of the Hall of Fame building, and the other $1.5 million was to finance a building which had been built for Ling Temco Vought here in Oklahoma City. The bonds were sold, and it was only through this effort that we were able to complete the first unit of the building. Had it not been for this interest and help on the part of the Oklahoma City Chamber of Commerce and the businessmen of Oklahoma City, no telling how long it would have been before we would have been able to complete this portion of the building and put it in operation. Construction was resumed on July 31, 1964, with a completion date set for the following summer, in time to take advantage of the tourist season of 1965. Glen Farris had served as general manager and later executive vice president of the institution ever since it was located in Oklahoma City. Until my retirement from the chamber on July 1, 1962, I carried on this job in connection with my work for the Chamber of Commerce. And when I retired from the chamber, I continued in this position and have served in that capacity since that time without compensation. As soon as construction was resumed and we were assured of a definite completion date, we started looking for a full-time director, and we're looking for an experienced museum man to handle this job. A number of applications were received and examined, but by unanimous choice of the selection committee, Dean Crakel, who at that time was director of the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was employed. He went to work on November 1, 1965. Correction, that's November 1, 1964, and was given a mandate to have something worthwhile completed in the way of a museum by May 30th of the following year. We all knew that this was a superhuman job, but he was willing to undertake it. It is certainly to his everlasting credit that by the following summer he had been able to put together a very outstanding staff, and they had assembled, mostly through borrowed art and other exhibit material, a most outstanding exhibit, and had it ready for an opening date at the beginning of the summer in 1965. due to some delay in getting the building completed, the opening date was delayed until June 26, 1965. On that date, a very memorable dedication ceremony was held, with Senator Millward Simpson of Wyoming, who had previously served as a trustee of the organization during the time that he was governor of Wyoming, was the principal speaker. The principal part of the ceremony was the raising of the various state flags on the plaza in front of the building. Many of the governors of the participating states were on hand to raise the flags of their states. It should be recorded that Stanley Draper, Executive Vice President of the Oklahoma City Chamber of Commerce, and Paul Strasbaugh, General Manager of the Trust and of the Chamber, have been of invaluable assistance in getting the project completed and started on its way. When the second campaign was held in Oklahoma City in 1961, it was felt that we needed some outstanding event to kick off the campaign. Therefore, with the assistance of the public relations firm of Ackerman Associates, we inaugurated the Western Heritage Awards, which was a competition to encourage more authentic depiction of the real Western Heritage Center in various media of communication. In this program, we seek to select the outstanding Western motion picture, factual television episode, fictional television episode, novel, nonfiction book, documentary film, juvenile book, magazine article, and musical composition. This awards competition has been held annually ever since that time, and has proven to be a wonderful avenue of publicity for the institution. Ben West, General Manager of KOCO-TV, served as Chairman of the Western Heritage Awards Committee for the first several years. Joe Jerkins is serving as Chairman this year. Mr. Jerkins is with WKY-TV. Roy P. Stewart, columnist for the Daily Oklahoman, has always maintained a very active interest in the Hall of Fame project, and ever since the time he went with the delegation to Denver, at which time the location was being sought for Oklahoma City, he has been a very active booster for the project. During the first year and a half of operations of the center, more than 500,000 people have visited the center, and the admissions are now increasing steadily. During the calendar year of 1966, a total of 317,063 admissions were recorded. Officers of the organization at present are Albert K. Mitchell of New Mexico, Chairman of the Board; Fred H. Dressler of Gardnerville, Nevada, President; A.M.G. Swenson of Stamford, Texas, First Vice President; Ray Schnell of North Dakota, Second Vice President; Nelson R. Crow of California, 3rd Vice President, Glen W. Farris, Executive Vice President, E.H. Shoemaker, Jr. of Nebraska, Secretary, and Jasper D. Ackerman of Colorado Springs, Treasurer. Other members of the Executive Committee are C.R. Anthony of Oklahoma City, F.L. Spencer of Great Falls, Montana, J.E. Browning of Arizona, and William Fancher of Washington. Some of the greatest supporters of the institution outside of Oklahoma have been Ralph A. Johnston of Houston, Texas, who until he passed away last summer had served a term on the Board of Trustees, J. Spencer Watkins of Montana, who single-handedly subscribed more than half of Montana's quota, Jasper D. Ackerman of Colorado Springs, who almost alone is responsible for Colorado having surpassed its quota, and Ray Snell of North Dakota, who almost single-handedly has raised North Dakota past its quota, and of course Albert K. Mitchell, whose leadership through the years has been one of the greatest factors that has put the project over. Mr. O.L. Bullock, now living in Oregon, has bequeathed his entire estate to the institution. Among the principal benefactors and supporters in Oklahoma City, other than those previously mentioned, have been Mr. C.A. Vos, Chairman of the Board of the First National Bank and Trust Company, Mr. Harvey P. Everest, President of the Liberty National Bank and Trust Company, Dean A. McGee, President of Kerr-McGee Corporation, Luther T. Dulaney, President of Dulaney's Manufacturers and Distributors, O.M. Red Mosier, who until his recent death served as chairman of our art committee, Edward L. Gaylord, Executive Vice President of the Oklahoma Publishing Company, H.H. Harrell, Chairman of the Board of the local Federal Savings and Loan Association, Donald S. Kennedy, Chairman of the Board of Oklahoma Gas and Electric Company, Cecil Webb, Vice President of the Oklahoma Natural Gas Company, Jordan B. Reeves, who has given us a great collection of guns, and Mr. and Mrs. John Kirkpatrick, who are now arranging to place a small herd of buffalo on our grounds. John Kilpatrick, Jr. is now serving as chairman of our local executive committee for operations. Principal members of the staff in addition to Mr. Krakel, and who have been with us since the beginning of operations in 1964, are Jim Boren, Art Director, Juan Menchaca, Chief Curator, Richard Muno, Exhibits Preparator, and Joe Lawhead, Director of Public Relations.